In a small town where everyone knew each other's name, there was a nurse who had worked tirelessly for years. Her name was Lisa, and she had dedicated her life to the healthcare profession. But despite her skill, her passion, and her years of service, Lisa wasn't always appreciated for who she was. In fact, in one of the most difficult moments of her career, she found herself facing something much darker than a simple lack of respect. She faced discrimination. This wasn't just a story about a nurse doing her job. This was about how her very identity, her race, became the target of bias and prejudice, even when she was saving lives every single day. It was a story of how, in the most critical moments, a family's judgment could be clouded by misconceptions and biases. But what happened next would leave them forever changed. A decision, made in haste and out of fear, would lead them to realize something they never imagined. It started with a call to the emergency room. A young man, in his 20s, had been rushed in with a severe, life-threatening injury after a car accident. His heart rate was dropping, and his body was going into shock. The doctors and nurses moved quickly, but it was clear that time was running out. Lisa was there, as she always was, calm under pressure, working with precision and care to stabilize the young man. She'd been through countless emergencies before, but there was something about this case, something that felt different. As Lisa did her job, she noticed the looks, the whispered comments behind her back, the hesitations in the family's eyes when they saw her. But she didn't have time to let it affect her. She focused on the task at hand. The young man was in critical condition, and he needed every ounce of effort she had to keep him alive. But it wasn't long before the family, his parents, his siblings, began to voice their discomfort. They didn't want Lisa to be the one working on their son. She could hear the muffled voices from outside the room, just beyond the privacy curtain, and her heart sank. This wasn't the first time she had faced this kind of discrimination, but it still hurt every time. "We don't want her," the father had said, his voice edged with something that made Lisa's skin crawl. "Isn't there anyone else?" The nurse on duty tried to reassure the family, but the damage had been done. It was clear that they didn't trust Lisa, simply because of the color of her skin. And in that moment, as her hands moved quickly to save the young man's life, she was left to wonder. How long would she continue to face this kind of judgment? How long before her skills and compassion would be recognized for what they were, and not tainted by someone else's bias? Lisa didn't know it yet, but what happened next would change everything. As the young man's condition worsened, it became clear that they needed to take drastic measures only Lisa could carry out. The family was desperate. They had no choice but to trust her, even if they didn't fully want to. She didn't hesitate. She did what she had been trained to do, with care and expertise. She worked quickly, and her determination paid off. Hours later, when the young man stabilized and his vitals began to improve, the family sat in stunned silence. The weight of what had just happened began to settle in. They had just watched a woman they had refused to trust save their son's life. But the story didn't end there. Because the family, in the face of their own guilt and shame, had to confront the ugly reality of their prejudice. And Lisa, though grateful that she had done her job, couldn't forget how she had been treated in the beginning. The next day, when the young man regained consciousness, he looked at his parents, his voice weak but filled with emotion. "I owe my life to her," he whispered. The room fell silent. His parents looked at each other, at a loss for words. It was only then that they realized the depth of their mistake, the harm they had done, not just to Lisa, but to their own son. But that wasn't the end of the story. As the days passed, the family struggled with what they had learned. They came to understand the complexity of their actions, but it wasn't as simple as saying sorry. Could a single apology undo the harm? Could they ever truly make it right? Lisa's life had been changed forever by that moment, and so had theirs. Would they be able to look beyond their own prejudices and find redemption? Or would the gap between what they thought they knew and what they had learned prove to be too wide to bridge? As Lisa walked away from the hospital after the long, grueling days of treatment, she couldn't shake the feeling that this story wasn't over. There was still so much left to be said, so much left to be done. And as for the family, they were still facing their own reckoning. But for now, the question lingered. How could you ever repay the person who saved your life when you didn't even trust them to begin with? Stay tuned, because the story is far from over. The days that followed the incident were heavy with silence. For Lisa, the exhaustion of saving a life wasn't just physical, it was emotional. Every shift she worked, every life she tried to save, She carried the weight of that family's judgment with her. She wasn't naive, she'd faced this kind of discrimination before. But this time was different. This time, she had done her job, and still, the suspicion in their eyes had cut deeper than she'd expected. They hadn't just questioned her abilities, they had questioned her worth as a person. And in that moment, Lisa had been forced to question her own place in the very system she had worked so hard to be a part of. The family, too, was struggling, but in a different way. The realization of their prejudice gnawed at them with each passing day. They tried to rationalize it, tried to bury their discomfort under layers of shame, but it never quite went away. The father, Robert, a stern man used to being in control, found himself staring at the ceiling late at night, replaying the moment he had dismissed Lisa's competence. He had been so quick to judge, so sure of his own opinions. But when he thought about his son, about how close they had come to losing him, it was impossible to deny the debt they owed to the very woman they had rejected. His wife, Karen, wasn't any better off. As a mother, she had always been fiercely protective of her children. She had raised them to respect others, to treat everyone with kindness, but somehow, when it came to that moment in the she had let her fears override the values she had tried to instill in them. She knew the mistake she had made, but like Robert, she didn't know how to fix it. How could you apologize for something so deeply ingrained? How could they make it right when they hadn't even known they were wrong in the first place? Their son, James, was still recovering in the hospital. The doctors had assured them he would be okay, but the emotional toll was taking longer to heal. He wasn't angry at his parents, at least, not in the way they feared, but he had been shaken by the entire experience. The last thing he remembered before the accident was the chaos of the crash and the rushing urgency of the And yet, he had woken up to find that the woman who had saved his life had been the one person they had almost pushed away. How could he reconcile that? How could he face the woman who had put everything on the line for him when his own parents had doubted her? Each of them was struggling with their own version of guilt, their own version of confusion. And Lisa, though she kept a brave face, wasn't sure how much longer she could carry the burden of their judgment. But there was no time to dwell on it. Lisa knew that every patient, every life that came through those doors needed her. She didn't have the luxury of reflecting on how people saw her. She had to push through, to keep doing the work that was asked of her. But as much as she tried to focus on the job, the shadows of that night seemed to follow her. She'd thought she had thick skin, that nothing could break her resolve. But it wasn't the direct insults or overt racism that had wounded her, it was the quiet, insidious rejection. The way they had looked at her, not as a nurse, but as someone unworthy of their trust simply because of her skin color. It was hard to shake. Weeks passed, and the family remained in a state of tension. They had tried to reach out to Lisa, but each time they did, they couldn't find the right words. How could they apologize when they had no idea what to even say? And deep down, they feared it might be too late. Lisa was already moving on, as she always did. She had a life to live, a career to build, and while she might carry their prejudice with her, she wasn't going to let it stop her from doing the work she loved. But it wasn't just the family who was affected by what had happened. Word had spread through the hospital, as it always did. Lisa wasn't just any nurse, she was one of the best. Her colleagues respected her, but that didn't mean they hadn't seen the way the family had acted. The whispers started to spread, too. Some nurses and doctors were sympathetic, others more skeptical, wondering how deep the division ran between the family's perception of Lisa and the reality of her skill. People didn't always know what to say when a situation like this arose. And that was the problem, nobody knew how to handle it. James, now out of the ICU and resting in a regular hospital room, was beginning to process everything. His mind kept returning to the moment when his father had refused Lisa's help. He had been unconscious, unaware of the tension unfolding around him. But now, as he lay in bed, recovering from his injuries, the gravity of what had happened settled in. Lisa had saved him. The woman who had been rejected, who had been told she wasn't good enough to care for him, had fought for his life. How could he face her? How could he look her in the eyes, knowing the truth of what had almost transpired? And what about his parents? How could he even begin to talk to them about what had happened in that room? James had always been a good son, raised to respect others, to be open-minded. But in this moment, he realized just how deep the divide ran. He had been raised in a world that taught him to see people for who they were, not the color of their skin. But in that hospital room, his parents had revealed something he wasn't prepared for, a part of themselves that he hadn't known existed. It wasn't that they were bad people. They were kind, loving, and well-intentioned. But prejudice, especially the quiet kind, the kind that hides behind assumptions and biases, could live in even the most well-meaning hearts. And now, James had to figure out how to navigate this new reality. He couldn't undo what had happened, but could he ever forgive his parents for their actions? And more importantly, could he make things right with Lisa? Because no matter how he looked at it, there was a debt to be paid. And he wasn't sure that an apology would be enough. As for Lisa, life in the hospital continued as it always did, constant, fast-paced, and unforgiving. She worked tirelessly, saving one life after another, always moving forward, never stopping. But in the back of her mind, the question lingered. Would the family ever understand what they had done? Could they ever truly see her for who she was, not just as a nurse, but as a person? Or would their prejudice always stand in the way of redemption? The uncertainty of it all weighed heavily on her. She knew the family was trying, but that wasn't enough. She had seen too much in her life to believe that good intentions could erase the harm done. And so, as the days passed, Lisa found herself caught between two worlds. The one where she was just doing her job, and the one where the scars of prejudice ran deep, leaving their mark in ways no one could truly understand. For now, the questions remained unanswered. And in that silence, the tension between Lisa and the family only grew. How long could this fragile truce last before everything came to a head? Days turned into weeks, and while the physical wounds on James's body began to heal, the emotional scars lingered, impossible to ignore. The tension in the family home had reached an almost unbearable level. Robert, unable to face the enormity of his mistake, retreated into his work. The weight of what he had done pressed heavily on him, yet he couldn't bring himself to admit it, not to Lisa, and not even to Karen. Every time he thought about that night, the image of his son's pale face as he was rushed into the filled him with dread. But it wasn't the accident that haunted him most, it was the idea that he had almost lost his son over his own ignorance, over a decision that had been made out of fear and bias. Karen, on the other hand, tried to distract herself with daily routines, cooking dinner, tending to the house, but even the simplest tasks felt hollow. She couldn't stop replaying the look on Lisa's face when she had been told she wasn't wanted. The image was seared into her mind, and it made her stomach churn with guilt. She had been so quick to side with her husband, so quick to shield her son from discomfort, that she hadn't even considered the bigger picture. Now, the feeling of not being able to take it back gnawed at her. How could they ever fix this? And more importantly, could they? James had been doing his best to hold the family together, but the cracks were starting to show. He found himself increasingly distant from both of his parents, and the guilt of his own role in the situation, his initial passivity, kept him up at night. He had been unconscious when his parents made their decision, but once he had regained his strength, he had been too caught up in his recovery to see the bigger problem. But now, it was impossible to ignore. Lisa had saved his life. And yet, his parents had nearly turned her away because of the color of her skin. The more he thought about it, the more he realized that nothing could undo what had happened. Words, apologies, they all felt like empty gestures now. Could they ever really make it right? The family's sense of guilt wasn't the only thing weighing on them. Lisa, too, felt the pressure of everything that had transpired. The hospital had become her refuge, but even there, she couldn't escape the tension. She had overheard a few conversations among her colleagues, some well-meaning, others less so. "Did you hear about the family that nearly sent that nurse packing?" one of the senior doctors had whispered. Lisa had stiffened, her hand tightening around her chart. It wasn't just the family's prejudice that stung. It was the subtle, constant reminders that she didn't belong, that no matter how hard she worked, she would always be seen as different. In the sterile, fluorescent-lit halls of the hospital, she had made peace with the fact that she might never fully belong, that her identity would always be something to be navigated, not embraced. But that didn't make it hurt any less. The whispers began to spread, and soon, Lisa was acutely aware of how she was being talked about. Some of her coworkers were supportive, but others were curious, asking too many questions or making offhand remarks about the incident. "She saved his life, didn't she?" one nurse had said with a wink. But the tone, so casual, so dismissive, made Lisa feel like her actions were nothing more than a footnote in a larger story that was still unfolding. One afternoon, as she was walking down the hall after a long shift, Lisa's path crossed with that of the family. Robert and Karen stood in the lobby, their expressions unreadable. James was with them, but he looked different, more withdrawn, like he was carrying the weight of something too heavy to put down. For a moment, none of them spoke. It was a brief, tense silence, the kind that felt thick and suffocating. Lisa hesitated. She had half expected this, but seeing them in person still made her stomach twist. Robert was the first to break the silence. "Lisa," he said, his voice surprisingly soft, yet strained. "Can we talk?" The words hung in the air, and for a brief second, Lisa wondered if she should walk away. She had done her job. She had saved James. And yet, the awkwardness in Robert's tone felt like an invitation to open a door she wasn't sure she wanted to walk through. But before she could make up her mind, James spoke up. "Please, we need to say something," he said, his voice low, almost apologetic. He stepped forward, glancing at his parents as if seeking their approval. Lisa's heart clenched. She could see the inner turmoil in James's eyes. He wasn't angry, but he was lost, caught between the love for his parents and the realization that they had failed him in a way that couldn't be undone. "I don't want your apology," Lisa said quietly, before either of them could continue. She was surprised at how calm her voice sounded, considering the storm swirling inside her. "I've done my job. What matters is that James is alive, and that's all I need to know." Robert opened his mouth, but Lisa raised a hand, stopping him. She wasn't sure why, but she wasn't ready to hear whatever excuse they had. "Not yet. What you said that night, it wasn't just about me. It was about how we see each other. It was about fear and assumptions and something deeper than what happened in that room." She paused, trying to collect herself. "I'm a nurse. I save lives. But I'm not some charity case for your guilt. I'm not here to make you feel better about what happened." The words stung more than she anticipated. But the truth of them rang clear in her chest, cutting through all the layers of defensiveness she'd built up over the years. Lisa had spent so much time trying to prove her worth, trying to show the world that she was good enough, that she was worthy of respect, but in that moment, she realized that even if they apologized, even if they understood, it wouldn't fix the bigger issue, the issue of how deeply ingrained these prejudices were. It was bigger than just one family. It was a sickness that spread through the very fabric of society. James, his expression a mix of guilt and determination, finally spoke up. "We know we can't change what happened. But we want to try. We don't know how to fix it, but we have to. I have to, at least." The words were raw, and Lisa saw the weight of them hanging in the air between them. But even though James was trying to reach out, there was something in his eyes that told her they were all still running from the same thing. An uncomfortable truth that none of them were ready to face. The conversation hung there, unfinished. Lisa turned and walked away, but as she moved down the hall, her heart was heavy with more questions than answers. Would they really try to change? Could they? Or was this just another empty promise? Another cycle of guilt and avoidance that would repeat itself until it faded into nothing? The tension was still thick, but the silence in the air only made it louder. None of them had the answers, not yet. And as Lisa made her way toward the staff break room, she couldn't shake the feeling that this story wasn't going to end neatly. It never did. The days that followed that brief encounter were filled with an air of uncertainty. It was as though the entire world had paused for a moment, holding its breath. Lisa threw herself into her work with even more determination, keeping her distance from the family. She couldn't afford to get tangled in their guilt, their well-meaning apologies. She had learned long ago that actions spoke louder than words, and words had already failed her too many times. At the same time, Robert and Karen couldn't stop thinking about what had happened. Every conversation they had, every moment spent together, felt incomplete. They hadn't fully confronted the shame that lingered in their hearts. They knew they had wronged Lisa, but that wasn't enough to fix what was broken. They were trying, but how do you apologize for something like this? The truth was, their minds kept circling back to one question. Could they ever truly change? Could they see past their own biases, their own fears? James was the only one who seemed to be moving forward. Or so he tried to convince himself. He visited Lisa every week now, sitting outside the for hours, hoping for a chance to speak with her, to apologize. But each time, she was too busy or too distant. He never caught her at the right moment, and the guilt weighed heavier on him with each passing day. He couldn't shake the memory of her calm, distant expression when she had refused their apology. "I don't need your apology," she had said. And something inside him had broken. It wasn't until James took the step of approaching Lisa's supervisor that things finally began to shift. Desperate to make things right, he tried to find out more about her, hoping to understand her better. He wanted to know her outside the context of his family's failure. Maybe if he knew more about her, he could understand why she had refused to meet them halfway. Maybe, just maybe, there was something he could do to fix this. But the more he learned, the more he realized just how deep the hurt ran. Lisa's entire career had been built on constantly proving herself, on trying to show people that her worth was not tied to the color of her skin. He discovered how many times she had faced rejection, how many doors had been closed in her face because of her race. The hospital, where she worked so hard to save lives, was just another battleground where she had to fight for respect, where the color of her skin was often an unspoken barrier. James found out that Lisa had worked through years of microaggressions, of feeling like she had to perform twice as well just to be considered competent. Yet, she had remained, never giving up on the work she loved. That was her true strength, not just her medical expertise, but the resilience to keep going despite it all. But knowing this only deepened James's own guilt. She had been fighting a battle he hadn't even known existed. And his parents, his own flesh and blood, had been part of the problem. One night, just as Lisa was finishing a particularly long shift, she saw James waiting outside the ER. This time, he wasn't sitting in silence. He was pacing, his hands running through his hair as if he was trying to find the words to say what he had been holding back for weeks. She paused for a moment, unsure if she should stop or walk past him. The hospital was busy, but her heart told her this moment felt different. "Lisa," James said when he saw her. His voice was quiet but desperate, tinged with the exhaustion of someone who had been carrying the weight of their own mistakes for too long. I just want to talk. I need you to understand." Lisa's eyes narrowed slightly, but she didn't move. She wasn't sure if she could take another conversation full of half-hearted apologies. "What's there to understand?" she asked, her voice flat, betraying none of the emotions that were brewing beneath the surface. "You've done all the talking already. Your parents came, they apologized, but nothing has changed." James flinched at her words. It stung. He wanted to explain, to somehow make her see that he wasn't like them, that he didn't share their biases, but the words wouldn't come. He had been raised to be better, to know better, and yet, in the most crucial moment of his life, he had let fear, prejudice, and ignorance dictate his actions. How could he make that right? "I've been trying to understand," he said finally, his voice thick with emotion. "But it's not enough, is it? I can't undo what happened. And my parents, they don't know how to make it right either. We've all failed you, Lisa. I don't know what to do anymore." There was a long pause between them, a silence filled with unspoken regret. Lisa didn't look away. She didn't need to. She could feel the depth of his remorse, and while she knew it wasn't enough, there was something in his eyes, a mixture of shame and a quiet plea for redemption, that stopped her from walking away. She had been on the receiving end of enough empty apologies to know when someone was truly trying. But this was different. This wasn't just an apology, this was a plea for understanding. "I wish it were that simple," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "You can't just apologize for something like this, James. It's not about saying sorry. It's about what comes after. It's about what you do when no one's looking. How you challenge the ideas that have been ingrained in you, in your parents, in this world. Apologies don't fix that." James's eyes were wide as she spoke, and for the first time, he realized just how much he had underestimated the complexity of the situation. It wasn't about his family anymore. It was about a much larger truth, one that spanned generations, one that was woven into the very fabric of the society they lived in. It was about how easy it was to perpetuate harm without even knowing it, how easy it was to live with prejudice without ever questioning it. "Do you think I'm going to forgive you just because you say the right words?" Lisa continued. "Do you think your parents can undo years of conditioning with a single apology? It's not that simple. It never has been." The weight of her words hit James like a physical blow. He had been so focused on what they had done to him, how his parents' actions had affected his own life, that he hadn't fully understood what they had done to her, to Lisa. He hadn't understood what it meant to live in a world where every day was a fight to prove your worth, to be seen as human, when the system itself was rigged against you. James's gaze dropped, and for the first time, he didn't try to defend himself or his parents. He just listened, and in that silence, Lisa's words lingered in the air between them, heavy and full of truth. The tension between them thickened, but it wasn't the kind of tension that could be easily broken. No, this was the kind that built up over years, over generations of injustice, of pain, and of silent suffering. And in that moment, neither of them knew how it would end. Neither of them knew if there was a way out. But what they both understood was that the path to resolution, to healing, wasn't going to be easy. And it certainly wasn't going to happen quickly. It would take time, and patience, and most importantly, it would take real, lasting change. But just as Lisa turned to walk away, she heard James call out to her again, his voice urgent. "What do we do now?" The question hung in the air, unanswered, as the world around them continued to spin, caught in the momentum of everything that had come before. And neither of them knew yet what the answer would be. As Lisa walked away from James, her mind a whirlwind of thoughts, she could feel the weight of their conversation hanging over her. She knew they were at a crossroads, James, her, the whole situation. But in the back of her mind, something nagged at her, something unsettling that she couldn't shake. The silence between them wasn't just a pause for reflection, it was the calm before a storm she hadn't seen coming. Hours later, as she sat in her small apartment, trying to decompress after the emotional drain of the day, her phone buzzed on the table. She glanced at the screen, expecting a message from a colleague, or perhaps an update from the hospital. Instead, it was an unknown number. She hesitated for a moment, then answered. "Hello? Is this Lisa Carter?" The voice on the other end was sharp, businesslike. "We need to talk." Lisa's pulse quickened. She didn't recognize the voice, but something about the tone felt urgent, cold. "Who is this?" "Let's just say I'm someone who knows what happened in the that night. You don't know me, but I know everything about you, Lisa. And I think you might want to hear what I have to say." A chill ran down her spine. This wasn't just some random call, it was something much darker. Lisa's instincts, honed over years of dealing with high-pressure situations, immediately kicked in. She needed to know who this was and what they wanted. "What do you want?" she asked, keeping her voice steady, though she was bracing herself for whatever came next. There was a pause, a long stretch of silence, before the voice came back, almost mocking. "Well, let's just say, your situation with the family? It's not as simple as you think. You've been played, Lisa." The words hit her like a slap to the face. Played? What the hell was this person talking about? The voice continued, lowering now, as if sharing a secret. "You've been so caught up in your own guilt and anger that you haven't seen what's really been going on. Do you really think it was just about a racist incident in the Or is there more to the story than you know?" Lisa's breath caught in her throat. The words felt like an accusation, but she didn't know what she was being accused of. "What are you talking about?" Another pause. And then the voice dropped a bombshell that made her stomach churn. "The family? They didn't just come to the out of nowhere. Robert's company, the one he's been working at for years? They've been under investigation for malpractice. It's big, Lisa. And your patient, James, was about to blow the lid off the whole thing." The room seemed to spin. Everything she had thought she knew about the situation, about the family, about the simple story of a nurse and a patient, was starting to unravel. Lisa's mind raced to make sense of the words, but they didn't add up. "Why are you telling me this?" she asked, her voice trembling despite herself. "What's your angle? What do you want from me?" The voice didn't answer immediately. Instead, there was a shift in the tone, something more sinister this time. "I'm giving you a chance, Lisa. A chance to make sure the truth gets out before someone silences it for good. You're a smart woman. You know how this works. You're not just up against a family anymore. You're up against powerful people, and I don't think you want to get in their way." The line went dead. Lisa stood there, staring at the phone in disbelief. The room felt too small, the air too thick. Everything inside her screamed that this couldn't be real, that there had to be some mistake. But deep down, she knew better. She'd seen the way things worked in the hospital, how lives could be swept aside for the sake of power, of money, of influence. She had always been a small player in the bigger game, but now, it felt like the stakes had just been raised to a level she couldn't ignore. Her heart pounded as she tried to process the information. If what the mysterious caller said was true, it meant that James's accident wasn't just some random tragedy. It had been part of something far more sinister. And the family? They weren't just the victims they appeared to be. They had their own secrets, secrets that went far beyond a simple misunderstanding in the The more Lisa thought about it, the more it all started to fall into place. Robert's company had always been well connected, powerful even. She had heard rumors about unethical practices before, but no one had ever been able to prove anything. And James, had he been part of something bigger? Was his life in danger not just because of the accident, but because he knew too much? The room felt suffocating, and Lisa needed answers. She couldn't keep walking around in the dark, trying to make sense of something so much bigger than herself. She had to go back to the hospital, back to the heart of the storm, where she could get the answers she needed. But even as she grabbed her coat, she felt a sense of dread creep over her. What if the caller was right? What if she was already too deep into something that would change everything? As she walked through the hospital doors, her mind was racing, trying to piece together the fragments of a puzzle she didn't even know existed. The halls were quiet for the moment, as most of the night shift staff were wrapping up. Lisa's eyes darted around, looking for anything unusual, anything that could hint at what was going on. She had to talk to someone who could help her make sense of the situation. But who could she trust? Her first thought was to find her supervisor, Dr. Martinez, someone she had worked with for years and who had always been a solid ally. But something stopped her. She had heard whispers, subtle hints from other nurses that Martinez had close ties to the hospital administration, to the very people who controlled the flow of information. What if he knew something about Robert's company? What if he had been part of keeping certain things quiet? The doubt gnawed at her, and Lisa quickly realized that she couldn't trust anyone without first finding out more for herself. She walked to the break room, her footsteps echoing down the long hallway, a sense of urgency overtaking her. As she stepped inside, the familiar faces of her colleagues didn't comfort her, they only added to her feeling of isolation. Everyone here had their own secrets, their own relationships with the system that ran this hospital. Who could she turn to now? And then, just as she was about to sit down and think through her next steps, her phone buzzed again. Another message. She checked it quickly. It was from an unknown number. "Meet me at the old storage room at midnight. I have more to tell you. Don't trust anyone." The message was simple, cryptic, and chilling. It was the second time in one night she'd been pulled into something much bigger than herself, and now, she had no choice but to follow the lead. But as she glanced around the break room, her gut told her she wasn't just going into a storage room for answers. She was walking right into the heart of something dangerous. She didn't know who was pulling the strings, or why they had chosen her. But she knew one thing for sure. This was no longer just about a nurse and a family. This was about something far darker, something that, if she wasn't careful, could swallow her whole. At midnight, the hospital's old storage room was as quiet as a tomb, its faint light casting long shadows across the cluttered shelves and boxes that had long been forgotten. Lisa's heart hammered in her chest as she approached the door. Her breath came in short, sharp bursts, the cool night air mixing with the adrenaline coursing through her veins. She had no idea who had sent her the message, but there was no turning back now. She had to know the truth, no matter how dangerous it might be. The door creaked open, and she stepped inside, her senses on high alert. The room smelled of dust and rust, a place left to decay untouched for years. But the silence was broken by a soft shuffle in the corner. A figure emerged from the shadows. "Drive. Martinez." Lisa froze. She hadn't expected him. In fact, she had considered him a potential suspect, but seeing him here in this secretive, secluded spot sent an icy chill through her. "Dr. Martinez," she said, trying to keep the shock from her voice. "What are you doing here?" Martinez didn't look surprised to see her. His face was grim, his eyes hard. "Lisa, you don't know the half of it." He stepped closer, and Lisa instinctively took a step back. She had always trusted Martinez, but the situation was spinning out of control, and every instinct now screamed to be cautious. "What's going on, then? What do you know about Robert's company, and why did someone send me here?" Lisa demanded, trying to keep her voice steady. Martinez looked around nervously, his gaze darting to the door and then back to her. "I didn't send you that message, Lisa. But I know who did." He paused, taking a deep breath. "It's bigger than you think. What you don't know is that James wasn't just some random patient. He was the key to exposing a massive corporate cover-up. A cover-up tied directly to Robert's company." Lisa's stomach tightened. "James? But how?" Martinez glanced over his shoulder, then lowered his voice. "James was set to testify against Robert's company for their illegal medical practices. The company has been skirting regulations for years, making huge profits off unethical medical procedures and falsified records. James worked as a consultant for them before the accident, and he knew too much. Lisa's mind raced. All the pieces were starting to fall into place, but the pieces didn't fit together perfectly. Then why wasn't he told? Why was he allowed to go on as normal? Martinez hesitated before answering. The company planned to silence him. They thought the accident would do it. But they underestimated the fact that James was close to you, and your role in his recovery might just be the thing that blows this whole thing wide open. Lisa's blood ran cold. The accident hadn't been an accident after all. It had been orchestrated. And in that moment, everything clicked. The reason Robert had been so insistent on refusing her help, the tension that had surrounded her from the moment James was brought in, it was all part of a bigger scheme. The family wasn't the innocent bystanders they appeared to be. They were deeply involved in a system of corruption. What do you mean they underestimated me? Lisa asked, feeling a sudden sense of clarity. What is this? A cover-up? And what does it have to do with me? Martinez looked at her with an expression she had never seen before: guilt, fear, and something else. They've been keeping tabs on you, Lisa. They knew you were close to James, and they knew that you were likely to help him. They figured if they could stop him from talking, they could stop the investigation. Lisa's breath caught. You're saying they planned this entire thing from the beginning? The accident, it was never random? Martinez nodded slowly. It wasn't an accident. They orchestrated it, hoping it would silence him for good. The realization hit Lisa like a punch to the gut. Everything, the quiet whispers at the hospital, the strange tension in her interactions with the family, the weird feeling she'd had every time she tried to push for the truth, was part of the same ugly web. She had been caught up in it without even realizing. I don't know what to do with this, Lisa whispered, more to herself than to Martinez. The silence stretched out between them, both of them lost in their own thoughts. But just as she was about to turn away, her phone buzzed again. She glanced at the screen, half expecting another cryptic message, but this one was different. It was from James. Lisa, I know what happened. I know everything. It's worse than we thought. They're coming for me. They're coming for all of us. Lisa's heart stopped. She rushed to call him back, but the line went dead. Who's coming for him? She muttered, barely aware that she had spoken out loud. Martinez was already pulling out his phone, his expression darkening as he read a message that mirrored Lisa's. They're targeting him now, he said, voice tight. The family, they're not who you think they are. Robert's been working with the company, all along. They knew James would come after them, and now they're trying to cover their tracks. Lisa felt her world tilt. Everything had shifted so quickly, so dramatically, that it was hard to keep up. But one thing was clear now. She was in the middle of something that was about to explode. Martinez reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a file. This is everything I have on Robert's company. The evidence James gathered, the reports he was going to submit, it's all in here. But we need to move fast, or it'll be destroyed. Before Lisa could respond, the sound of footsteps echoed through the hall. The door to the storage room creaked open, and they both turned instinctively, their hearts in their throats. A shadow moved into the room, followed by another, and then another. Figures. 2 men, dressed in black, their faces concealed by masks. Lisa froze, her instincts screaming at her to run, but it was too late. You're too late, one of the men said, his voice cold and metallic. We know what you're doing. And we can't let it happen. The other man stepped forward, pulling a gun from his jacket. Lisa's blood ran cold as the barrel pointed directly at her chest. But then, just as quickly, the door burst open again. James rushed in, blood smeared on his shirt, his face pale but determined. Not so fast, he shouted, as he pulled something from his bag and tossed it to Lisa. It was a small flash drive, one that seemed to contain everything they had been fighting for. The 2 men turned, startled by James's sudden appearance, but before they could react, Martinez lunged at one of them, tackling him to the ground. Lisa grabbed the flash drive, her hands shaking. She looked at James, who was now backing toward the door, motioning for them to follow. But before they could escape, a final twist hit them. Robert, standing in the doorway, his face a mask of cold fury. You've made a big mistake, all of you, he said, his voice low and controlled. You should have stayed out of this. Lisa couldn't believe her eyes. Robert wasn't the victim here. He was the mastermind behind it all. James turned to her, his eyes wide with disbelief. You knew, didn't you? He asked softly. You knew all along. Lisa didn't answer right away, because the truth was still sinking in. They had all been pawns in a game far bigger than they had realized. The stakes had just gotten higher. And in that moment, with the weight of everything crashing down around them, they all knew the fight was only just beginning.